Candlelight trembled beneath the chandeliers of Beaumont House, scattering shards of gold across silk gowns and polished marble, as though beauty itself had splintered under the weight of whispered judgment. The orchestra's waltz floated lightly through the grand ballroom, yet beneath its grace moved another rhythm, quieter, sharper, the rustle of scandal. At the center of that invisible storm stood Miss Eliza Ashbourne, her gloved hands folded with deliberate composure, her chin lifted just high enough to defy the tremor that threatened her poise. She wore pale blue satin, modest and unadorned, but the simplicity only sharpened the room's appetite for spectacle. It was not her gown they had gathered to inspect, it was her fall. She was promised to Lord Nathaniel, murmured one lady behind a painted fan, her eyes gleaming. And now he is dead. And she carries more than grief, another replied softly, though not softly enough. The words struck like pebbles against glass. Eliza did not flinch. She had long ago discovered that humiliation, when met with silence, lost some of its power. Yet silence had become her only defense, for to speak the truth would unravel more than her own reputation. It would stain the noble house that had once welcomed her with music and promise. Lord Nathaniel Beaumont had been laughter and sunlight, a man too warm for the cold architecture of his lineage. He had pressed wildflowers into her hand during summer rides and sworn, beneath the hush of ancient oaks, that vows whispered before God were as binding as those proclaimed before Parliament. No witnesses had stood beside them, no ink had sealed their pledge. There had been only faith, reckless and tender. Then fever had taken him within a fortnight, leaving behind condolences edged with suspicion and a silence heavier than mourning. Now the Duke of Harrowmere, Nathaniel's elder brother, remained abroad, cloaked in official duties and grief. In his absence, the Beaumont family had acted swiftly. A formal announcement would be made tonight, the matriarch had declared, to preserve dignity and extinguish rumor. Eliza had been summoned not as honored guest, but as necessary casualty. A matron approached her, dropping a lace handkerchief at Eliza's feet with theatrical accident. Eliza stooped to retrieve it, her movements measured, and offered it back with a small curtsy. The lady accepted it without gratitude and drifted away, leaving behind the faint scent of rosewater and disdain. Each gesture in the ballroom felt choreographed to remind Eliza of her precarious place. At the far end of the hall, a footman struck the floor with his staff. Conversation stilled. The Dowager Duchess, regal in black satin, stepped forward, her expression carved from propriety. "It is my solemn duty," she began, her voice smooth as lacquer, "to clarify certain misunderstandings that have troubled our circle. My late son, Lord Nathaniel Beaumont, left no lawful betrothal nor any binding obligation. The House of Beaumont shall not entertain unfounded claims upon its name." A collective exhale swept the room. The words were courteous, yet their blade was unmistakable. Eliza felt the air thin around her. No lawful betrothal. No binding obligation. The vows beneath the oaks dissolved like mist before the law. She pressed one hand briefly against her abdomen, a gesture so slight none would note it, yet it anchored her resolve. The child she carried did not vanish because society preferred convenience. Her father stood near the orchestra, his shoulders rigid. He did not look at her. He had once boasted of her grace, her prospects. Tonight he seemed aged by disappointment he dared not name. She understood his fear. A daughter undone by scandal imperiled not only herself, but every fragile alliance stitched by polite society. The waltz resumed, though its melody now felt brittle. Couples turned, skirts whispering across polished floors, as if the announcement had merely adjusted the evening's arrangement. Eliza remained motionless, aware that departure would signal guilt, yet staying felt akin to surrender. She had planned to leave London before dawn, to retreat to a distant cousin's cottage where whispers might fade into the countryside wind. It would be exile, but dignified exile. She would raise Nathaniel's child quietly, asking nothing of the Beaumont name. A sudden shift rippled through the assembly, an alteration in posture, a tightening of breath. The great doors at the ballroom's entrance opened once more. Rain-damp night air curled inward, extinguishing several candles along the threshold. A tall figure stepped inside, removing dark gloves with unhurried precision. Alexander Beaumont, Duke of Harrowmere, had returned. He wore mourning black, the severity of his attire accentuating the controlled power in his stance. His gaze swept the room with a composure that unsettled even the boldest gossipers. Conversation faltered, then thinned to silence. No one had expected him tonight. He paused only briefly before approaching the Dowager Duchess. Their exchange was quiet, but whatever she whispered caused a subtle hardening at the edge of his jaw. Then his eyes moved, slowly, deliberately, until they found Eliza. She had met the Duke only a handful of times before Nathaniel's death. Where his brother had been warmth, Alexander had been winter, measured, distant, every word weighed before spoken. Yet as he crossed the ballroom now, the air seemed to part for him, not in deference alone but in apprehension. He stopped before her. The orchestra, uncertain, allowed the final notes to die. "It would seem, Miss Ashbourne," he said at last, his voice low yet carrying effortlessly across the hush, "that London has misplaced its sense of mercy." Eliza inclined her head, refusing the comfort his tone might offer. "London forgets nothing, Your Grace. It merely pretends not to see." A flicker, approval perhaps, touched his expression. He studied her more closely than etiquette permitted, and in that gaze she sensed recognition, not of scandal but of endurance. Rain glistened faintly upon his shoulders, as though he had come directly from the storm. "I regret my absence," he continued quietly. "It appears decisions have been rendered in haste." "They were rendered in clarity," she replied, though her voice trembled despite her will. "Your family has made its position plain." "And yours?" he asked. She felt the weight of 100 watching eyes. To confess would invite ruin, to deny would betray the child within her. "My position, Your Grace, is not one society is inclined to defend." Silence gathered between them, dense and charged. Then, with a steadiness that startled even the Dowager Duchess, the Duke extended his arm. "Miss Ashbourne," he said, each word precise, "you will grant me a private conversation." Gasps fractured the stillness. A duke did not request such privacy with a woman under scandal unless compelled by something formidable. Eliza hesitated only a heartbeat before placing her gloved fingers upon his sleeve. If exile awaited her at dawn, she would face it having spoken truth at least once more. As he led her toward the shadowed corridor beyond the ballroom, whispers surged anew, sharper than before. Yet for the first time that evening they did not pursue her alone. They followed him as well. The doors closed behind them with a muted thud, sealing off candlelight and scrutiny. In the dim corridor, where portraits of stern ancestors watched from gilded frames, the Duke released her hand but did not step away. His eyes, darker here, held neither accusation nor pity, only decision. "Before another word is spoken in that hall," he murmured, "I require the truth from you, Miss Ashbourne." And in that quiet demand lay the promise that the night's cruelty had not yet reached its final reckoning. Rain swept across London before dawn, washing the cobblestones in silver and turning carriage wheels into blurred halos beneath the street lamps. Miss Eliza Ashbourne stood beneath the narrow awning of her father's townhouse, a single valise at her feet, her breath unsteady in the cold morning air. The city had not yet stirred, and she had chosen that hour deliberately. Humiliation seemed less brutal when no audience attended it. Within the carriage waiting at the curb lay her future: quiet exile in the countryside, anonymity purchased at the cost of every dream she had once entertained beneath summer oaks. She had not slept after her encounter with the Duke. His demand for truth had been neither cruel nor tender, but exacting. She had answered him with composure that cost her dearly, admitting what society already suspected yet refusing to clothe it in apology. She had spoken of vows exchanged in faith, of promises uttered beneath God's sky, of the child who would arrive whether acknowledged or not. He had listened without interruption, his gaze unflinching. When she finished, he had said only, "I shall consider what is owed," before escorting her back into the ballroom with a restraint that unsettled gossip more than scandal ever could. Now, as she prepared to vanish from London's memory, hoofbeats echoed faintly along the empty street. A rider approached at measured pace, dismounted without flourish, and removed his hat against the rain. Alexander Beaumont, Duke of Harrowmere, looked less a sovereign of society and more a man who had ridden through a storm to keep an appointment with conscience. "You depart without farewell," he observed, glancing at the waiting carriage. "I depart with what remains to me," Eliza replied. "Farewells suggest expectation of return." His eyes lingered on the valise, then on her face, pale but resolute. From within his coat he produced a small velvet case, dark as mourning ribbon. He held it between them, not offering it yet, as though weighing its significance. "My brother carried this always," he said quietly. "It bears the Beaumont crest, yet he wore it not as ornament but as pledge." Eliza felt the world narrow to the object in his hand. "I cannot accept charity, Your Grace." "It is not charity." He opened the case. Within lay Lord Nathaniel's signet ring, its gold warmed by years of familiar touch. "It is acknowledgment." The word trembled in the air. To accept it would be to claim publicly what had been denied. To refuse would preserve the Duke from entanglement and herself from fresh scrutiny. Her gloved fingers hovered, then withdrew. "Your family has made its position clear," she said. "I will not be the instrument of further discord." For the first time, something like impatience flashed across his composed features. "Discord," he repeated softly, "was born the moment my brother was buried and truth was traded for convenience." He stepped closer, rain threading through his dark hair, and pressed the velvet case into her hand. The contact was brief, deliberate. "You mistake me, Miss Ashbourne. I do not offer you protection in secret. I offer it in daylight." Before she could answer, another carriage rounded the corner and slowed. Two ladies leaned forward within its shelter, their glances sharpened by curiosity. The Duke did not retreat. Instead, he took Eliza's arm and guided her from the awning into the open street, rain beating upon her cloak. "Walk with me," he said. "At this hour?" she whispered, aware of the carriage's watchful eyes. "At this hour precisely." They moved along the slick pavement, past shuttered shops and silent townhouses. The Duke's stride was unhurried, his posture unmistakable. He did not conceal their proximity, he made it visible. Servants peered from doorways, coachmen tipped their hats in astonishment. Each step transformed private rumor into public declaration. "Why would you court further scandal?" Eliza asked, struggling to match his pace. "I do not court scandal," he replied evenly. "I correct injustice." The simplicity of the statement unsettled her more than any flourish could have done. "And if correction costs you reputation?" "Reputation," he said, "is sustained by action, not by fear." They reached Hyde Park as dawn paled the horizon. Mist hovered above the grass, blurring the statues into spectral witnesses. He halted beneath a line of elms and turned to face her fully. "My brother intended to marry you," he said. "His steward has confirmed it. Arrangements were to be made quietly upon his return from Kent. His death prevented the ceremony, not his will." The revelation struck her like sudden sunlight. She had known Nathaniel's heart, yet doubt had crept into her solitude. Then why did the dowager? "Because haste is often mistaken for prudence," the Duke interrupted. "And because scandal, if smothered swiftly, rarely breathes again." He removed his gloves slowly, exposing hands marked not by idleness but by discipline. "I will not permit my brother's child to be spoken of as burden." The word child hung between them, fragile and immense. Eliza felt tears threaten, yet she held them back. "You speak as though the matter rests solely with you." "It rests with honor," he answered. "And honor, Miss Ashbourne, is my charge." Hoofbeats sounded again behind them. A gentleman from White's Club reined in his horse, astonishment plain upon his face. The Duke inclined his head in greeting without relinquishing Eliza's arm. By noon, London would know of this morning's walk. By evening, speculation would blaze brighter than ever. She understood then that the Duke's gesture was no impulse of pity. It was strategy, deliberate and irrevocable. "You risk much," she said quietly. "I risk little compared to what you have borne in silence." His gaze softened, not with sentiment but with decision forged. "The matter shall be settled before sunrise tomorrow." She searched his expression for meaning, but found only resolve. The carriage she had meant to board waited forgotten at the curb behind them, its driver bewildered. The ring lay heavy in her palm, its crest pressing against her skin like a promise not yet defined. "Your Grace," she whispered, "what do you intend?" He met her eyes without hesitation. "To ensure that when this child draws its first breath, the world will already know its name." And with that vow suspended in the mist between them, the future shifted, no longer a road of exile, but a threshold she had not yet dared to imagine. Firelight pooled across the dark-paneled library of Harrowmere House, casting amber reflections along shelves burdened with leather-bound histories and inherited law. Outside, rain threaded steadily against the tall windows, muting the distant rumble of carriages and enclosing the chamber in deliberate privacy. Miss Eliza Ashbourne stood near the hearth, her cloak laid aside, the faint swell beneath her gown visible only to one who knew to look. Before her, Alexander Beaumont, Duke of Harrowmere, rested one hand upon the carved mantel, his posture composed yet taut, as though bracing against a decision already forming. "You asked for truth," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. "I will not diminish it with modesty." He inclined his head. "I require nothing less." She drew a measured breath. "Your brother loved without calculation. He believed that promises spoken in sincerity required no witness but God. We pledged ourselves beneath the oaks at Ashbourne Hollow. There was no license, no priest. Only conviction. The Duke's gaze did not waver. And you trusted that conviction. I trusted him. The correction carried both reverence and ache. When he fell ill, he spoke of arranging matters formally upon his return from Kent. Fever claimed him before that could be accomplished. I have no parchment to display, no ring exchanged in public ceremony. I possess only his word, and the child he left in my keeping. Silence gathered, heavy yet unbroken. The crackle of the fire seemed impertinent against the weight of confession. Eliza felt the familiar sting of humiliation rise, but she refused to let it master her. I did not seek to entangle your family. I would have left London without appeal, had you not intervened. The Duke moved from the mantel and approached the long table at the center of the room, where papers lay ordered with military precision. He removed his gloves slowly, setting them aside as though relinquishing some invisible barrier. You mistake my intervention, he said evenly. It was not compelled by rumor, but by duty. Duty to whom? She asked, unable to keep the tremor from her question. To my brother's memory, he replied. And to justice. She studied him then, truly studied him. Beneath the severity of his expression lingered fatigue not solely born of travel. There was conflict in him, disciplined yet unmistakable, as if affection and obligation wrestled beneath the surface of composure. I do not desire rescue, she said softly. Nor do I wish to bind you to scandal in the name of honor. I will bear what consequence is mine. His jaw tightened. You speak as though consequence were a solitary burden. In society's eyes it is. In mine it is not. The words settled between them, startling in their quiet insistence. He stepped closer, not enough to breach propriety, yet near enough that she sensed the gravity of his resolve. You carry a Beaumont air, he continued. Whether sanctioned by Parliament or whispered beneath trees, my brother's intention is evident. That intention confers responsibility. Responsibility does not require marriage, she said quickly, the notion rising like alarm. A settlement could be arranged. I would accept discretion. Discretion, he echoed, a faint edge entering his tone. Is that what you endured in that ballroom? Was it discretion when my mother denied your claim before half of London? The memory stung. It was protection, she insisted, though the word felt hollow. For whom? He pressed. She had no answer that did not wound. He turned toward the fire, hands clasped behind his back, and for a moment his composure fractured. I misjudged you, he admitted, voice lower. I believed you a pleasant ornament in my brother's orbit, charming but transient. Yet you stood before accusation without plea or protest. You preserved his dignity at the expense of your own. The acknowledgment pierced her defenses more keenly than insult ever had. Love rarely calculates advantage, she whispered. He faced her again, something altered in his expression. Less winter, more tempered steel. Then allow me to calculate where you would not. She sensed the shift before he spoke it aloud. The air in the library felt charged, as though the storm outside had crept within. I will marry you, he said. The declaration did not thunder. It settled, deliberate and immovable. Eliza stared at him, unable to reconcile the magnitude of the offer with the measured tone in which it was delivered. You would sacrifice your prospects, she replied faintly. You could choose any alliance in England. I choose as I deem fit, he answered. And I do not consider this sacrifice. She shook her head, stepping back. You are moved by conscience. Conscience is noble, but it is not affection. His gaze sharpened. Affection is seldom born of ease. You cannot mean to tether yourself to scandal for a sentiment not yet formed. And you cannot presume to know what is forming, he countered quietly. The intensity of his reply unsettled her. She turned away, pressing her hand against the cool edge of the table. I will not have you regret this, she said, fighting the tremor in her voice. Your kindness would become my greatest burden. He crossed the space between them with restrained urgency. This is not kindness, he insisted. It is recognition. Of what? Of courage, he said. Of loyalty. Of a strength I failed to see until it was tested. Her breath faltered. No man had ever spoken to her thus, not Nathaniel in his warmth, nor any suitor in polished admiration. This was not flattery, it was appraisal. I cannot accept, she murmured, though doubt now threaded her refusal. You deserve a bride unshadowed by controversy. I did not ask whether I deserved you, he replied, each word deliberate. I asked whether you would trust me. Trust. The word resonated deeper than love, deeper than honor. It implied partnership, not rescue. Outside, the rain intensified, striking the windows like impatient fingers. Within, the fire burned lower, shadows stretching across the walls where generations of Beaumont ancestors watched in silent judgment. "If I agree," she said at last, her voice barely audible, "it will not be from desperation. It will be from choice," he answered. Their eyes held, neither yielding. The future stood before them, stark and unadorned. She felt the weight of the ring in her pocket, the steady reminder of promise unfinished. To accept the Duke's offer would transform scandal into declaration, secrecy into defiance. He extended his hand, not to command but to invite. And in the space between their fingers, hovering like a suspended verdict, lay the question that would determine whether dawn would bring exile, or a union no one in London could have foreseen. Fog lay low across the square as dawn approached, softening the rigid outlines of London into something almost merciful. The small chapel of St. Bartholomew stood at the edge of that mist, its narrow windows dimly lit by lanterns hastily hung along the stone walls. Within those walls waited a decision that would either silence scandal or set it ablaze beyond recall. Eliza Ashbourne stepped from the carriage without assistance, her spine straight despite the tremor that lived beneath her composure. She wore no bridal white. Instead, her gown was a muted dove gray, modest in cut, unembellished by lace or jewels. It was the attire of a woman who sought neither spectacle nor absolution. The child she carried pressed gently against her ribs, a quiet reminder that this moment was larger than reputation. Alexander Beaumont, Duke of Harrowmere, stood at the chapel doors before she reached them. He had chosen formal morning attire, black coat severe against the paling sky, his expression composed with almost martial restraint. He did not move toward her at once, as though granting her space for retreat. The choice he had made clear must remain hers. "You have not yet entered," he observed, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I wish to be certain you had not reconsidered," she replied, holding his gaze. His jaw tightened faintly. "I do not act in haste, Miss Ashbourne." "Nor in pity?" she asked, needing the assurance even now. "Pity would have hidden you," he answered. "I intend to honor you." The word steadied her more than any vow could have done. She inclined her head, accepting the arm he offered. Together they crossed the threshold. Inside, the chapel smelled faintly of wax and damp stone. A single clergyman waited near the altar, summoned discreetly and instructed with minimal explanation. Two witnesses stood to one side, the Duke's longtime steward and an elderly housekeeper who had served the Beaumont family for decades. Their presence was not spectacle but testament. Yet the world beyond the chapel had not remained ignorant. As Eliza and the Duke advanced toward the altar, the muted rumble of carriage wheels reached even through stone walls. Word, it seemed, traveled faster than dawn. Members of the ton, alerted by servants and speculation, had gathered in the square outside. They had come to witness folly or courage. Eliza felt the weight of that unseen audience, but she did not falter. If humiliation had forged her resilience, this moment would test its strength. The clergyman began the ceremony in solemn cadence. The words of matrimony echoed through the modest nave, ancient and unyielding. When the question of consent was posed, Alexander did not wait for repetition. "With full knowledge and unshaken will," he said clearly, his voice carrying not only to the altar but, it seemed, to the fog beyond the doors. Eliza's breath caught. No tremor marked his declaration, no hesitation shadowed it. It was not the language of obligation but of resolve. When her turn came, she answered without ornament. "I do." There was no swelling orchestra, no cascade of petals. There was only the gravity of two individuals binding their futures against the will of expectation. The Duke removed his signet ring, the very emblem of Beaumont authority, and placed it upon her finger before accepting a simple band in return. The gesture was unmistakable. He did not shield his name, he offered it. As the final blessing was spoken, the chapel doors opened without warning. A gust of cold morning air swept inside, and with it the murmur of assembled society. Silhouettes filled the entryway, cloaked in curiosity and disbelief. For a fraction of a moment, tension tightened the room. Eliza felt the old instinct to shrink, to disappear beneath scrutiny. But the Duke's hand closed firmly around hers. "Remain," he murmured, not as command but as promise. The clergyman concluded the rite. Husband and wife. Alexander turned toward the doorway, drawing Eliza beside him. The gathered onlookers parted slightly, uncertain whether to advance or retreat. Faces that had whispered condemnation now searched for weakness. The Dowager Duchess stood among them, her expression unreadable, her pride at war with circumstance. The Duke descended the chapel steps with deliberate calm, guiding Eliza into full view of the crowd. Fog curled around them like stage smoke, heightening the drama of the tableau. "My lords, my ladies," he began, his voice carrying effortlessly across the square, "you are witnesses to a lawful union." A ripple of murmurs answered him. "My wife," he continued, the word resonant and unambiguous, "has endured speculation with greater dignity than many who cast it. I will not permit further insult to her name, or to the child she bears." The declaration struck the assembly like a bell toll. No euphemism softened it, no discretion diluted its force. He claimed both woman and child without qualification. Eliza felt the tremor in her limbs subside, replaced by something steadier, something akin to belonging. For the first time since Nathaniel's death, she did not stand alone beneath scrutiny. She stood beside a man who had chosen visibility over comfort. A woman near the front dared to whisper, "It is madness." Alexander's gaze found the source of the remark with measured precision. "Madness," he replied evenly, "is allowing fear to dictate justice." Silence followed, deeper than before. He turned then to Eliza, his expression softening in a manner none present had ever witnessed. With deliberate care, he lifted the faint veil that framed her face, not as conquest but as acknowledgement. His lips brushed her brow, a gesture restrained yet unmistakably intimate. "You shall never stand in shadow again," he said quietly, though the square seemed to hear it. Behind them, the chapel bells began to ring, summoned perhaps by instinct or by the steward's discreet signal. Their peal cut through fog and gossip alike, transforming scandal into proclamation. Eliza met her husband's gaze and saw not sacrifice but certainty. The world might continue to whisper, but it would do so against the fortress of his resolve. As the bells echoed across London, Alexander drew her toward the waiting carriage, not the modest conveyance of exile she had once intended to board, but the ducal coach emblazoned with Beaumont arms. He assisted her inside before turning to face the crowd one final time. "Let it be known," he said, his tone calm yet irrevocable, "that before this day fully dawns, the house of Beaumont has chosen its duchess." And as the carriage doors closed and wheels began to turn, carrying them toward a future neither simple nor secure, the fog lifted just enough to reveal the sun breaking at last across the city they had dared to confront. Spring arrived cautiously at Harrowmere, as though uncertain whether the estate would welcome renewal after so turbulent a winter. Pale sunlight filtered through budding wisteria, tracing fragile patterns across the gravel sweep before the manor. Within those walls, Eliza Beaumont, no longer Miss Ashbourne, no longer an exile in waiting, stood at the tall windows of the drawing-room, one hand resting unconsciously over the gentle curve of her abdomen. London had not ceased its whispering, but distance had softened the sting. Here, among ancient oaks and measured routines, she had begun to learn the quiet rhythm of belonging. Yet belonging did not erase doubt. Across the estate, tenants watched their new duchess with cautious curiosity. Servants observed her for signs of arrogance or fragility. She sensed their scrutiny and met it not with hauteur but with patient dignity. She learned names quickly, listened more than she spoke, and insisted upon visiting the village school despite the dowager's raised brow. Every gesture was deliberate, not to win affection, but to honor the name she now bore. Alexander watched her without intrusion. He had not sought gratitude, nor had he pressed affection upon her like a debt to be repaid. Their marriage, born in defiance of scandal, unfolded with measured restraint. They dined together each evening, conversed with quiet candor, and navigated proximity as one might approach a powerful current, aware of its force, respectful of its unpredictability. One evening, as twilight settled violet against the horizon, he joined her in the garden where magnolias had begun to bloom. She stood among them, fingertips brushing porcelain petals. "You have altered this house," he observed. "I have only opened its windows," she replied softly. "It was waiting for air." He regarded her with that steady gaze which no longer unsettled but steadied her. "London continues to speculate," he said. "Invitations have been withheld." "Then let them withhold," she answered, surprising even herself with the firmness of her tone. "I did not marry for invitations." A faint smile touched his lips. "Nor did I." In that shared acknowledgment lay a shift neither had anticipated. Their union was no longer solely shield or proclamation, it was partnership forged through trial. The true reckoning arrived sooner than expected. A formal summons from London requested their presence at a state dinner hosted in honor of a visiting foreign dignitary. Attendance was not optional. Refusal would signal weakness. Acceptance would invite renewed scrutiny. Alexander brought the letter to her study, placing it upon the desk between them. "You are not obliged," he said quietly. She lifted her gaze. "If I retreat, they will say you married a coward. They may say worse regardless. Then let them witness otherwise." On the night of the dinner, London glittered with orchestrated opulence. Chandeliers blazed above mirrored walls, reflecting silk and jewels in dazzling repetition. Conversations faltered as the Duke and Duchess of Harrowmere were announced. Eliza entered on Alexander's arm, clad in deep emerald that honored neither mourning nor apology. The subtle curve of her figure was unmistakable now, yet she carried it not as burden but as declaration. Eyes followed her every step. Some held admiration reluctantly granted, others sharpened with resentment. The dowager observed from across the room, inscrutable as ever. A matron, emboldened by wine and habit, murmured just loudly enough to be heard, "How swiftly disgrace adorns itself." Eliza felt the word strike, but before she could muster reply, Alexander turned with unhurried precision. "Disgrace," he said calmly, "is the refuge of those who mistake gossip for virtue." The surrounding circle stilled. His tone remained civil, yet its authority cut cleanly through the murmur. He offered his arm to Eliza once more and guided her toward the center of the hall as the orchestra began its waltz. "May I?" he asked, though propriety required no permission. "You may," she replied. They moved together across polished floors, their steps measured and unhurried. There was no ostentation in their dance, only assurance. Eliza felt the steadiness of his hand at her waist, the quiet confidence in his lead. Each turn seemed to rewrite the narrative whispered about them. They were not spectacle, they were sovereign. When the dance concluded, applause rose, not thunderous but sincere. The dowager inclined her head almost imperceptibly. It was not surrender but recognition. Weeks later, as winter's memory dissolved entirely, labor began before dawn at Harrowmere. Snow lingered in pale drifts along the fields, and the sky hung heavy with impending light. Eliza gripped the carved bedpost through waves of pain that seemed determined to split her resolve. Alexander remained at her side despite convention, his composure strained yet unwavering. "You need not witness this," she gasped between contractions. "I will not be absent," he answered, his voice firm though his knuckles whitened around her hand. Hours stretched, taut and relentless. At last, as the first blush of sunrise crested the horizon, a cry pierced the chamber, strong, insistent, alive. The midwife placed the child in Alexander's trembling arms before offering him to Eliza. He stared at the tiny face, astonishment and reverence mingling in his expression. "A son," he whispered. Eliza reached for them both, exhaustion dissolving into fierce tenderness. "He arrived before the sun," she murmured faintly. "As his mother once did," Alexander replied, recalling the morning he had found her poised for exile. He bent and pressed his lips gently to her brow, not in gratitude alone but in awe. The scandal that had threatened to consume them felt distant, irrelevant beside the fragile weight of new life. By afternoon, word had traveled beyond the estate. Some would continue to mutter, others would adjust their opinions with convenient grace. Yet within Harrowmere's walls, certainty reigned. Days later, Alexander carried his son into the gardens where magnolias had fully opened. Eliza walked beside him, her steps slow but resolute. Servants paused in their duties to watch, their expressions softened by the sight. He turned to her, the child secure against his chest. "You feared I sacrificed happiness," he said quietly. She met his gaze, no longer shadowed by doubt. "And you proved me mistaken. I did not marry my brother's memory," he continued, voice steady. "I married the bravest woman in England." The words settled not as proclamation but as truth long acknowledged. Sunlight filtered through blossoms, illuminating them in fragile gold. The path ahead would not be without challenge. Society's memory was long, and power seldom yielded entirely. But they no longer faced it divided by silence. As the infant stirred and opened curious eyes to the brightness of spring, Alexander extended his free hand to Eliza. She placed hers within it without hesitation. Together they stood beneath the flowering trees, scandal transfigured into legacy, exile transformed into home, and in the quiet warmth of that shared resolve lay a triumph greater than vindication. A love chosen before dawn, now undeniable in the full light of day.